Dopamine is fundamental to our survival. It's the chemical that we make in our brain that tells us this is something we should approach, explore, investigate. The more you seek out pleasure, the more you will get pain, the more you will seek out pleasure again. So there is this vicious circle that we're getting in. Hi, and welcome to Lead Well. Have you ever asked yourself about the level of dopamine in your brain? Well, if you haven't, it's probably a good idea that you start thinking about it, because I have found out that dopamine is actually driving a lot of our behaviors. Now, the first time I came across dopamine was when I had my burnout. And I did not realize immediately, but after probably 3 to 4 months of having had my breakdown, I went to see a therapist, and she told me to absolutely go see a stress medicine specialist, because turns out that when you had a burnout, the brain chemicals, especially neurotransmitters, have changed in your brain. And this explains such a lot of things. And I came to learn that my dopamine levels were really, really low, as were my cortisol levels, by the way. And so this was the very first time I started thinking about dopamine, and I tried desperately to figure out how does it all work and why are these levels low and what can I do to increase them. And it was really hard for me to find any kind of information until I came across a book that is called Dopamine Nation from Dr. Anna Lembke. And this book, for the very first time, explained to me what dopamine actually is and how it is impacted by all the different things that we're doing and we're experiencing. And then a week or so ago, I looked into another podcast, a podcast that is called Diary of a CEO, where there was an interview with this same Dr. Anna Lembke. And if at any point you have 2 hours that you can spend listening to a podcast, this is an episode that I highly recommend, and I will definitely also link it to the show notes here, because I will give you a very, very short, quick intro into what Dr. Anna Lembke has discussed there and what you will find also in her book. But if you're like me and you want to dig deeper and you want to understand how it all works, highly recommend to listen to that podcast episode of the Diary of a CEO. Now, what is this dopamine? So, dopamine has an essential role in our survival. What it does, it's probably known as the reward chemical. So, the neurotransmitter that tells your brain that something good has happened. However, the one thing that it does even more is it drives our motivation. It drives us to seek out things, to experience things, to be interested. Actually, there was an experiment where, unfortunately, with poor rats, they depleted them from dopamine and figured out that they could put food right in front of them, and the rats would not move, not even a few steps towards the food to actually get it. When they put it in their mouth, they started chewing, but they would not get there. So this is how important dopamine is to us, because it makes us get to the things that we need. And it made a perfect sense in ancient times when we were still living in caves, where there was scarcity around there. So we were driven, we had to be driven to seek out our food. We had to be driven to go for things that were sweet, for example, to get the necessary nutrition. And the interesting thing is that once we get there, there is a mechanism that sets in that is actually anti-rewarding. But let me get there. So let me give you a quote from Anne's book, The Dopamine Nation. She says, dopamine is fundamental to our survival. It's the chemical that we make in our brain that tells us this is something we should approach, explore, investigate. So we need it. We need it to get going. And when I refer back to my burnout situation, I didn't have a lot of motivation back then. And one of the reasons was that my dopamine levels were so low. So let's look into that even more, because an even newer finding in science is that in our brains, pain and pleasure are processed in the exact same area. For our brain, pain and pleasure stick together. And our brain wants to have neither a lot of pleasure nor a lot of pain. Our brain wants to have a balance, wants to have an equilibrium between both. And this is called homeostasis. So our brain will always do whatever it can to get back to a level. That, of course, once you understand that, this is so important, because the more fun you have, the more excitement, the more sweets, for example, you're consuming, the more our brain tries to level that out by providing pain. And so there is also this theory that humans these days experience more pain because of that, because we have literally we have a challenge. Everything around us is available in abundance, so we are overexposed to things like social media, which gives us pleasure. We're exposed to processed foods, which give us much more pleasure, much more dopamine is released when we eat processed food, when we eat sugary food, than what our ancestors could achieve. And so this balance is really disrupted by the environment that we're living in, by the availability of all the things that we think are good for us. But our brains don't like this only good for us. It needs to balance things back. Now, there is another quote that I found so interesting. The more dopamine that's released, the faster that is released, the more likely that drug is to be addictive for a given individual. Everything that we like, everything that gives us pleasure, releases dopamine in our brain. And the thing is that we don't get addicted to the dopamine itself, but we do get addicted to the substances or the behaviors, the things that release dopamine. Now, I've told you before, our brains are wired for scarcity. That's how we're set up. We're set up so that we're always looking for that little thing that we can get out there, because, yeah, in the past, it was really hard to survive. And now we have to face this overabundance. So, again, let me give you another quote, because I think this is so impressive how she's phrasing that. She says, we're all wired to be addicted. And if you're not addicted yet, it's right around the corner, coming at a website near you. Because our brains are wired that way, that if there are things that are releasing dopamine. We want more of that. And the more we get of it, the more we need, up to a point where there is this depletion and dopamine is no longer produced in such high volume. And that is the difficulty also with addiction because we need more and more of that substance. And addiction, how she defines it, is the continued and compulsive consumption of a substance or behavior despite its harm to self and or others. So if you're spending a lot of time on your phone instead of moving around, instead of spending time with your friends and family, that can be harmful. If you can get away from it, that's great. If you feel scarcity once you do, think twice. You might already be addicted to that. And when you're addicted, you're not trying to self-harm. You're trying to deal with pain, and you're always trying to find a way to deal with pain because, as we learned before, pain and pleasure are in the same place in the brain. Brain wants to have homeostasis. So if you have a lot of pleasure, it kind of fills in things that are painful, thoughts that are painful, maybe even pain in your body, so that there is homeostasis again. So the more you seek out pleasure, the more you will get pain, the more you will seek out pleasure again. So there is this vicious circle that we're getting in. Now, the good thing is there is a way out. It's not easy. It can be really hard because everything is so easy for us to obtain these days and it's so addictive. And also, when you think about social media, I mean, those guys, they put in a lot of brain power to understand how addiction works, and those tools are set up in a way to make everyone addicted. So, what can you do to get away from it? According again to Dr. Anna Lembke, I'm sticking to her research today. She says, go on a fast, abstain from your substance, abstain from your behaviors that you feel are problematic for a period of 30 days, 30 days. And you will find that in the first 2 weeks, you will probably experience withdrawal symptoms. And you will probably also have a craving for the substance. And then she says more than 2 weeks, because there have been experiments where people with cocaine addiction, they even had low level of dopamine production after 2 weeks of withdrawal. So your brain can recalibrate, but it takes time, and it takes approximately 30 days to do that. So that's why the recommendation is to go on a fast for 30 days. Recognize your triggers. There is this trigger acronym of health, which is hunger, anger, loneliness, and tiredness. In those situations, we usually are triggered more. In those situations, it's really harder for us to stay away from those substances and behaviors. So create barriers. Make sure that, like me, I'm on day 4 of my sugar fast. So when I go to the grocery store, I make sure that I don't buy any, so I don't have a lot of sweets and chocolates here in the house, so that it's easier for me to stay away from that. And it's also an option to actually induce pain, unpleasant experience, to then have a dopamine production afterwards. Because again, if you experience pain, your brain wants to get this balance. That is why having a cold shower, going for a run, going for a longer run, which makes you actually feel exhausted, can help with that. However, there is a limit to that as well. You can get addicted to those painful experiences as well, because the dopamine levels will rise after that, and your body will understand that as well and will get used to it as well. So yes, you can work against once you're aware of it, once you're aware that the environment that we're living in is actually not the environment that we're made for. It's not the environment that our brains and our bodies and our neurotransmitters have been made for. This is why try this 30-day dopamine fast and see how it develops. So balancing out your dopamine levels really is not something that comes natural. It's something that requires effort, because as I said before, we are living in a world that our bodies, our brains are not made for. And so this is what you need to be aware of and what you can work against by also doing hard and painful things. And the other thing is, make sure you get in the driver's seat. You're not a victim of your life. Being in the driver's seat and taking responsibilities actually is a proven way to have a more balanced life. So to recap, dopamine is a very, very powerful substance. The world we live in makes it actually very, very hard for us to keep that balanced. And so it's great if you can adopt proactive strategies to work towards a wonderful life that keeps that balance between pain and pleasure in the right place. And if you go on the pain side first, the pleasure side will come automatically. If you go on the pleasure side first, the pain will come automatically. So make sure that you level that out. And there is a way out. It might not be as easy as you think. I think nowadays we all expect things to be easy. We all expect things to be fast. We all expect to be happy all the time, which actually is not how we're set up to be. And I think accepting that and acknowledging that, and also realizing it that yes, everyone is struggling in some way or the other, I think is already helping a lot. And if you do struggle with addiction, please seek professional help, because yes, it's possible, but it's always good when you're not alone. So recommendation for you, if you found this topic interesting, look at the Diary of a CEO episode with Dr. Anna Lembke. And of course, I highly recommend also to read her book, Dopamine Nation, which will give you additional insights. And of course, you will find a link to Anna Lemke's work and also the other podcast I've mentioned in the show notes. Thank you and bye.
This was Lead Well. Now, what is the one thing that you're taking away from this episode? Please share in the comments below, and do share the podcast with your friends and family, but only if you like it.